Long, long ago, in the mountains of Georgia, there lived a peasant. So long ago, in fact, that the peasant's name is unknown. What we do know is that this peasant was not the brightest man to ever have existed. Possibly not quite the thickest man to ever have existed, but certainly not the brightest man to ever have existed. But he was married, and they had a child. And the wife was a good mother, but not necessarily a good wife, for she heaped her scorn and contempt upon her husband for his lack of brains, his lack of skills, his lack of talents, that he was never able to earn much money to bring them out of their poverty. The fact that she had chosen to marry him, of course, she never held against herself, but she held his lack of talent against him, and never missed a chance to nag at him. And on one particular occasion, when the boy was on the verge of manhood, that sort of age where parents were beginning to think about the future careers of their children and where they should put them towards, she said to her husband, "Husband, you must find an apprenticeship for our son, because if he grows up to be as gormless as you are, then we will be forever in poverty until we are old and grey and dead. He is our one hope out of poverty, because you will not do anything or learn anything. You haven't the brains to learn anything to bring us out of poverty. Therefore, it is down to you to find him a good master, someone who will teach him skills, someone who will teach him abilities with which, when he is grown, he can make the fortune that you have never made." And this poor, put-upon peasant said, as millions of husbands the world over have always said, "Yes, dear," for he knew that a quiet life was worth something, even when a happy life is not possible. And so he took the son, and they travelled and they travelled and they travelled mile upon mile. They spoke to the carpenter, they spoke to the blacksmith, they spoke to the cheesemaker, they spoke to the baker, they spoke to one person after another, asking if the boy could have an apprenticeship with this master or that master. And each and every one of them said, "Well, I already have an apprentice, I don't need another apprentice." And they were sent upon their way until their feet were aching and their shoes nearly worn through, and their throats were dry, for it was a hot day, and they'd wandered so far out the village they didn't really know where they were anymore. And there up ahead was a stream, a little refreshing, wonderful stream, and they knelt down and they drank and they drank and they drank till they were as intoxicated as if they had been drinking the finest wines. And when they stood up, and the father said, "You are the most wonderful stream I have ever drunk from." For in that day and age, people showed respect to water, and to many other things too, for that matter, even if not always to their husbands or to their wives. The waters in the stream began to bubble and move and shift, and a figure emerged from the waters, a great noble figure, a strapping figure, not a man, not a human figure, some strange being from a different level of reality. And the being said to them, "My name is Vakhraca, and you, I see, are a troubled soul. Tell me what it is that you want, little man." And the peasant, shaking in his boots, explained the situation with his wife and his son and the quest for an apprenticeship. And Vakhraca said, "I will take your boy. I will train him in many skills and many arts. I will teach him the ways of magic, and these ways he will always be able to make his own living in the world." "And in exchange?" asked the peasant, for it was common enough to offer something in exchange to a master who takes upon your son or daughter as an apprentice. "Ah," said Vakhraca, "you have nothing that I could possibly want. But I say to this, come back in 1 year and 1 day. Come to my court, follow the stream to its root, to its source, and there you will find my court. And if you can identify your son after 1 year and 1 day, then you may take him with you, and with him all of the knowledge that I have placed in his head. But if you fail, then I will keep your son forever and you will never see him again, nor benefit from the knowledge that I impart to him. Well, what was that poor peasant to do but tug his forelock, say yes sir, no sir, thank you sir, bid farewell to his son, though his heart was heaving, and return home and tell his wife that he had found an apprenticeship. Of course, he was a little bit cagey about quite what he told his wife, because she was handy with the rolling pin, and, well, there were no refuges for him to run off to in that day and age. A year and a day passed, and to that poor peasant it seemed like 3 years and 3 days, for such was that with a sense of loss he felt for his son. But he made his way back at the end of the year and the day, and he found the river, found the stream, and he made his way all the way up to the origins of the stream, where it bubbled forth from the earth, and there it bubbled forth from a gap in a courtyard, a great courtyard surrounded by walls and a magnificent house, the like of which he had never seen before. Not anywhere in the village, nor on his journeys to the market, never had he seen such a building in his life. It was so wondrous. And there in the courtyard there was not just one child, there were dozens upon dozens of children. Boys, girls, everywhere, of different ages. And the poor peasant, it'd been a year and a day since he'd seen his child, and children do change in a year and a day. And he stood there scratching his head, and as I said, he didn't have the greatest brains in the world, but whilst he couldn't quite work out which one was his son, the son easily recognised him and ran up to his father and embraced him and hugged him, said, "Oh, I've missed you so much in the year and a day, but I've learned so much from Vakhraca. But I'm ready to leave now, because I've seen what happens to the children he keeps hold of. For all of these other children here are also Vakhraca's apprentices. What I will do is this. When Vakhraca awakes, he will work his magic and turn us into birds and send us off, and we will fly back again. But I will make sure I am the very last one to land in the courtyard. Then you will know that bird is me." And true as the boy had said, within a few minutes a bell resounded, and Vakhraca awoke and came down into the courtyard and saw the peasant and said, "Ah, I remember you. You've come back for your son. Well, this is your test." And he cast a spell, and at once all of the children turned into pigeons, and they took to the air and they flew off, and they flew around and around, and within a few minutes this great cloud of pigeons came back down into the courtyard. And that poor peasant watched to see which the very last pigeon was, a full minute and a half behind all of the other pigeons in landing. And at once the peasant pointed to that pigeon and said, "That is my son." And Vakhraca seethed and hissed and spat, but he knew the man was right, and Vakhraca was pretty damn sure that some trick had been played on him, for he was a cunning and wise spirit of the river. But an oath is an oath, and a deal is a deal, and so Vakhraca had to let the boy go. And on the way home, well, once the father had told his son all of his news, and Vakhraca's former apprentice, the boy, had told his father his news, the father had to admit he was still just as poor as the day on which they'd parted. And the boy said, "Well, all of these skills I've learned, we must be able to put them to some use to make our lives better. Yours and mine and mother's lives better." And as they were discussing, they saw up ahead, some distance in the road, a party of very wealthy, very well-to-do, very well-dressed huntsmen. And they had with them a greyhound, and the greyhound was racing off after hares, but the hares were going hither and yon, left, right and centre, and the poor old greyhound, which was several years past its best, simply couldn't catch a hare for love nor money. And the boy whispered to his father, "I will turn myself into a greyhound, and you must sell me to these men for a damn good price, mind you. And I will go off with them, and the first opportunity I get, I will turn back into a boy and rejoin you on the journey home." So this is what they did. The boy turned himself into a greyhound and raced off ahead of his father, caught a hare and brought it back to the father. And the rich huntsmen were very impressed, and they clapped and they said how magnificent this dog was, and would the peasant sell it to them. And the father, just as his son had told him, he ummed and he ahed and said, "Oh, well, that's not very much money." And so they upped their deal. "Oh, that's not very much," and they upped their deal further, until at last a good, decent price was agreed. And they bought the dog, and off they went with the dog. And a mile down the road, they thought, "Let's test this dog again." And they took it off the lead and set it after some hares. And of course, the dog never came back. It just disappeared into the bushes. and when it was well out of sight of the huntsman, it turned itself back into the boy, and the boy, using his magic, tracked down his father, who was part way home. But even as they fell to walking side by side again and laughing at the trick, the boy said, it's the money we've got is good, but it'll keep us in fine style for maybe 3-4 months. But it'd be nice to have more than that. So we can move into a decent place and really sort our lives out. And up ahead they saw a party of more huntsmen. This time they were falconers rather than houndsmen. And they were watching this poor old falcon whizzing around the skies trying to capture pigeons and pheasants and all manner of things to put up on the wealthy gentleman's table. And the boy said, let's repeat the same trick as before, and they did. Except this time, of course, the boy turned himself into a falcon and zoomed to the skies, grabbed the nearest pigeon and brought it back to the father. And at once these well-to-do gentlemen were surrounding the peasant and clapping him on the back and offering more and more and more money for this wonderful falcon. And a deal was struck, and off the father went, now with 2 big bags of money either side of his belt. And the falconers went off happy as Larry with their bird until the time, merely half-hour later, when they set the bird to flying, and off it went and didn't come back, but turned into a boy when it was out of sight and rejoined the father. And on they went, until at length they came in sight of the town, a mere 1.5 miles from home by now. And the boy said to his father, let's do this one last time, 3rd time for the best luck. There is a horse fair in town today. See all the people there. A horse fair. I will turn into a horse. You'll sell me. And we'll play the same trick again. But, father, I must tell you this. Do not sell me to a man with 2 differently coloured eyes. For if you paid close attention, you will have noticed that wizard, that sorcerer, that spirit of the river, Vakhraca, has a blue eye and a brown eye. If you see a man that looks like that, it will be him in disguise, for he can change his shape, he can change everything about his appearance, but never his eyes. And if you are unwise enough to take the money he offers, just do not give him the bridle, for once he has the bridle on my back, and you hand it to him and he walks away, well, I am done for. And off they went into the town. The boy turned into a magnificent horse, and they went to market, and person after person, trader after trader, bid more and more and more money for the horse, until finally an enormous sum was offered for the horse, 10 times more than anybody else had offered. And the peasant, the poor silly father, the greed got the better of him. He said, yes, I will take that. It's more money than he could have dreamt of in a lifetime. And the man handed him this great sack of money, and at once the father noticed a blue eye and a brown eye. And he should have been wise, but he wasn't a wise man. As I said, he may as well have had a head full of straw for all the good his brains ever did him. The bridle was put upon the horse, and the new owner said, good sir, will you pass me the bridle? And the father did, and as soon as he handed over the bridle, he handed over his son. And of course it was Vakhraca, who took the horse boy back to his stables and said, I think it will do you good, young man, to remain as a horse for a year and a day before I allow you to become a boy again. It will teach you a lesson to be loyal to your master and not your family. Well, the horse was shut up in the stables. He was fed, he was watered, but he was shut up in the stables and not allowed out. And there he sat for 3 days and 3 nights in the doldrums, thinking he'd never see his father again, he'd never see his mother again, he'd be stuck in this wretched stables for a year. And it weighed heavily upon him. But as he sat there on the 3rd day, the clouds of rain that had been falling for 3 days, rain after rain after rain, as sad in the sky as the boy was sad in his heart, well, they cleared and the sun came out. And when the sun came out, it fell down upon the stables, and there was a small hole in the wall where a beam of sunlight hit the straw of the stable floor. And it was the first time the horse boy had noticed that there was this hole in the wall, because there hadn't been enough sun to make the hole clear before. And at once he thought to himself, I know what I do. I can't turn into a boy, but I can turn into a mouse. And he changed himself from a great big horse to a tiny little mouse and scurried out of that hole. But just as he was getting out of the hole in the wall, so that was when Vakhraca stepped into the stables, ready to take the horse for a ride, and saw no horse, but instead a mouse, and knew to himself, for he was a wizard, a spirit of great renown, that that mouse could be none other than that wretched, wretched boy. And so the wizard Vakhraca turned himself into a cat and zoomed off after the mouse. And cat and mouse chased around and around and around and around the woods and the fields, rushing away further and further from where Vakhraca lived, and closer to where the boy lived. Until at length it felt as if the cat was about to devour the mouse at any minute. The mouse was exhausted, could go no further, but they'd come to the edge of a lake. And so Vakhraca reached out his paw to snatch up that mouse, and the mouse leapt into the water, and the boy turned himself from a mouse into a fish and dived deep into the river stream, swimming and swimming and swimming, leaving the cat on the bank, for it was not a cat that much liked the water. But even as the cat set up on the bank, it shifted and it turned and it changed, and Vakhraca the wizard transformed himself into a fishing net and threw himself into the waters. And whereas most ordinary fishing nets would simply have sunk to the bottom of the lake, because this was a magical fishing net, it moved and it slid through the waters like kind of a jellyfish, chasing after the fish, trying to envelop him, trying to wrap the fish up in its own nettiness. But the fish always managed to get further and further away, until again the fish was nearly exhausted a second time over, and the net was about to engulf it at any minute, when it looked up and it thought to itself, I could escape out of the waters, and it leapt up into the air and transformed itself into a pheasant and took to the wing, flying far and far away from that lake. And the net emerged like a living, slimy, weed-covered being onto the banks of the lake, and looked up, even though it had no eyes, it looked up into the sky and saw the pheasant flying away, and transformed itself into a hawk, into a falcon, and took off, flapping after the pheasant, chasing and chasing and chasing, until the poor old pheasant was nearly exhausted for a fourth time, and had lost the will for all this racing and racing and racing, and looked down, feeling the beak of the falcon snapping upon its tails, looked down and saw the king sitting in his court. He was paying a royal visit to the area where the boy had been born in, and there was the king holding court and sitting there on his throne, pronouncing judgments to all and sundry, and there, next to the king, a bowl of fruit for him to devour. And the pheasant, near dead with exhaustion, transformed itself into an apple and fell down, 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 and landed in the king's lap. And the king picked it up and looked up and thought, where on earth did this apple fall from? There was no trees above him, no apple trees above him. The apple had just fallen out of the sky. It was a lovely looking apple. And the king was thinking about eating it, when, lo and behold, the bird that had been chasing the pheasant, that snapping falcon, transformed itself and fell and fell and fell as a knife, and landed on the table next to the king. And he looked up again. Where on earth did that knife fall from? But apple and knife, the two seemed to go together. And he picked up the knife, and it was a wonderful sharp knife, and he was about to slice the apple in two, and of course kill the boy entirely, when the apple, almost as if it had a life of its own, rolled out of his hand, fell upon the floor, and transformed itself into a great big pile of millet, tiny, tiny grains, thousands upon thousands of grains. And the knife which the king held in his hand, which seemed, when he picked it up, an ordinary knife, now twisted and turned and pulled itself from his grip, and even as it tumbled to the floor, shifted and turned and changed into a great big fat chicken, and landed upon the ground next to the millet. And the king, well, he was scared out of his wits to see these two things happen, but he sat and he watched as the chicken plucked and pecked and pecked and pecked and pecked and pecked at the millet, until there was only one final grain of millet left. And it was about to open its beak and consume the very last grain of millet, when the millet, that grain, turned into a needle and lay there, too sharp and too pointy and, well, metal, for the chicken to eat. It would have killed the chicken outright if it had tried to swallow it. And so the chicken eyed with its beadiest eye the needle. And what goes with a needle? Well, there's nothing that eats a needle but, of course, a thread. And the chicken turned itself into a thread and slithered like a serpent across the ground and threaded itself through the eye of the needle and was gradually pulling the needle across the dirt, as if it would drag this needle all of the way back to the castle in which Vakhraca lived. When, just as the thread was pulling the needle in this way, so the needle started to pull the thread in that way, and pulled it towards the campfire that was warming the king's toes, threw itself across the fire, and the thread, in being dragged through the flames, was gone, incinerated in seconds. And so Vakhraca, who wasn't dead, he was a wizard, he couldn't die so easily, was nonetheless banished back to his own residence at the source of the river that was his essence. And it was a long, long time before he was able to heal himself of his wounds and journey out into the world again. By which time that needle had turned itself back into a boy, gone home to father and mother, who were counting their newfound wealth, and grew into a wise and wonderful man who was able to use his magical learning to help his father and his mother and the other villagers and himself. Thank you.